mics are on.
There you go. There you go.
Okay, we have audio, video. We're ready when you are.
Okay, I'll call this City Council work session together. This is Monday, September 11th, 2023. It's 5:30. And it's just a work session. We do take roll, correct? But we don't have a pledge.
Correct.
Could
Okay.
you take roll, please?
Roll call. Calhoun.
Yeah, here.
Barnwell is excused. Wells.
Here.
DeMoss.
Here.
Finch. Here. Osenga.
Here.
And Mayor McClure.
Here.
Okay, you have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. So the topic of tonight is the electric utility rate study. And before I ask for that to begin, does administration have anything to say, or shall we just jump right into it?
Just jump right in.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Rob and everyone. Mike Hubbard. And yeah.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Council. We do want to come in and share the results of our most recent rate study. Mike Hubbard, we're glad to have him here in person. He's with the Financial Engineering Company, and he's been working, with Ford and its rate for 10 years or more. So again, we're glad to have him here. We're not going to waste a lot of time, so we can just get him right into the presentation and get going. Mike, turn it over to you.
Okay, just to expand on the background just a little bit. I do live in Maine now, but I lived in Anchorage for 20-some years, and I've worked with electric utilities throughout the state. Just about, not all of them, but the majority of them I've worked with utilities at one time or another. And I've been doing rate studies since 1980. I hate to date myself back that far, but I started in California and then moved to Alaska. So with that in mind, we'll go into the rate study, and if we could go to the slide. Tonight's agenda, what I'm going to talk about, I'd like to start out with a few terms, kind of a boring 101, if you will. We'll start out with a few terms, and then why and how cost of service studies are done. And then get into the analysis. And I know that that's what everybody wants to hear, but I think some of this early stuff is important to understand and to gain a little perspective on how we should interpret the results. Next slide. A few terms. We'll just go through this high level. We have peak demand. And that is the highest rate of power usage on your system during the month. That is it's measured with meters. And we also apply that to certain customers as well. And we measure that in kilowatts or megawatts. The class coincident peak is the peak of a rate class, of a specific rate class, at the time of the system monthly peak. And that may or may not be its own system peak at that time. And the class non-coincident peak is the peak of that class at any time during the month. And it's important to remember that, like I said, the first one is measured with meters, and the next two, they are estimated. And we'll see how these come into play here in a few slides. So next slide, please. What we're going to be talking about tonight is the base rates, and I want to stress that. And so, in order to get a better understanding, we have base rates and the cost of power adjustment. The base rate is to recover your non-fuel costs, your non-purchase power costs. It's the system cost of what you incur. And the base rates are typically split out into a customer charge, an energy charge, and a demand charge. And like I say, that rate is implemented to collect your system costs and is charged. You're the one, the council is the one that sets those base rates. And if the utility is regulated, then the next step would be to take the rates to the regulatory commission and where they would approve them. cost of power adjustment, or COPA on the other hand, is a rate to collect your cost of fuel and your purchase power costs. And those rates are changed automatically. You typically have a tariff in place that says, we're going to change this cost of power adjustment. I'll speak loud. The cost of power adjustment is, again, it's to recover your cost of purchase power and your fuel. And you have something in place that says that you're going to change it every quarter, every month, or whatever, to reflect the actual cost. It acts as a pass-through. And if you're forward-looking, sometimes you're off, so you keep a balancing account, and just to make sure that you're not overcharging for that. So Seward's cost of power adjustment recovers your cost of purchase power from Chugach. Chugach, in turn, they sell you power, and their cost of power is based on their base rates that they charge you, their customer charge, their energy charge, their demand charge, as well as their own cost of fuel. And so it gets maybe a little bit convoluted, but what we're talking about right now, tonight, is just your base rates and excluding all of the cost of power from Chugach. Okay? And I might say too that on your bill, when I say base rates, I'm including customer charge in there, but on your bills that you send out to everybody, that customer charge is split out from the energy charge, but it is included as one of the base rates. Okay, next slide. We have a couple more, and then we'll get into the results here. So why are cost of service studies performed? Why don't we just take the total cost of our infrastructure, our expenses, and divide by the number of sales and come up with a rate? Well, that doesn't really reflect the investment that you have to make for each customer. Each customer has a different usage pattern, or each customer class has a different usage pattern. You have to put in larger transformers, build a bigger system for your large customers. For residential, you may have several customers on the same transformer. So they impact your costs in different ways. And if we had the same rate for everybody, it's not going to reflect what that is, or those different impacts. And so what we do is we go through a process such that we are allocating costs such that the cost causer is the cost payer. In other words, we develop rates that reflect what that cost is to serve that customer or that customer class. Okay, next slide. How are they performed? Well, the expenses of your utility, as I just said, they're reflective of the various customers and customer classes and how they affect your expenses. And so the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners, NARUC, has recognized this, and they have developed the cost allocation manual, which we all refer to as the NARUC manual. And in it, it prescribes how we should do these things. If you are a regulated utility in the state of Alaska, if you're rate regulated, you have to perform your cost of service study based on the NARUC manual. That is in the regulations. And even though Seward is not rate regulated, we perform it as if it were, and we use the NARUC manual for it. And the last thing I want to mention, and I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, is that it's not an exact science. When we come up and say somebody is 95, or let's just say they're 91% of their cost of service, you know, I mean, we have to remember that it's not an exact science, and that's not 91. It's you know, 91 plus or minus. So we just have to take that in mind and keep that in mind as we go forward here. Okay, next slide. This just shows graphically, this is my last slide on Boring 101 here, but the process we go through is we come up with the revenue requirements, which is done through the budgeting process with the city here. If we were rate regulated, we might do it a little bit differently, but we come up with the revenue requirements, and then we functionalize everything. And we functionalize it as a generation, transmission related, distribution related, or whatever. And then what we do is we take those costs that are functionalized and then we classify them. Are they related to the coincident peak? Are they related to the non-coincident peak? Are they related to energy? Are they related to the number of customers? And what type of customers? And that's where this non-coincident peak and coincident peak comes into play. So again, we have to make these estimates, and it's not an exact science. And once we classify everything, we then allocate them to each rate class based on their contribution to the coincident peak, to the non-coincident peak, and so on. And then we design rates. The one thing that, when you look at this chart here, one thing you want to take away from this is when you go down through here, with the exception of generation, which would be fuel, that's variable related, that's energy related. But everything else is dependent on your system peak or the number of customers. What that tells you is that all your costs, other than your purchase power costs, all your costs are fixed. So if we add more customers, our costs are not really going to change that much. Or if our customers go away, our costs are not going to change that much. Now, if we have new customers that are big, we might have to add more infrastructure for them. But for the most part, your costs are fixed. And we have to remember that as we go along. Okay? So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. So on the analysis, what I'm going to talk about are the two scenarios that we investigated. I'll describe those, and then we'll talk about some of the assumptions that went into the analysis. One are the loads, and then the revenue requirements. Revenue requirements is the main thing. And then we'll go into the adequacy of the existing rates, and then on an overall basis, and then how close they are to the cost of service. And then we'll go into some rate options. Okay, next slide. So the two scenarios that we investigated. One was scenario one, which is to retain the utility. And if we're going to retain the utility, we're going to make certain improvements that are required. And it's also based on the assumption that we're going to have staff additions, and we're also going to increase some of the staff salaries. Scenario two, which would be sell the utility. And that does not include the additional staffing, nor does it include the capital improvements, the cost of those. And then I might add too that if the decision is made to sell the utility, it's not going to happen overnight. The utility that purchases it is most likely going to have to go through the regulatory process with the commission, and that can take up to a year. So again, it's not going to happen overnight, so you can't just say, oh, we're selling the utility and then wash your hands with it. You're going to have to run it for a year or so. Okay, next slide. Let's get into loads. So these are the loads, the energy sales of, since 2012. And as you can see, total sales have decreased over time. Then they kind of level out, and kind of leveled out during the pandemic time era,
and then started to rebound after that. So in between 2020 and 2021, we had a 4.3% increase in sales. And for the next year into 2022, it was just a little bit less than 1%. And during all this time, our customers, the number of customers remained about the same. So it's the usage patterns and of what we see. So in between 2021 and 2022, when we had a little less than 1% increase in sales, the large general service and special contract, they went up with a little less than 2%. Harbor, which is relatively small, they went up quite a bit of 8.6%. Small general service went up about 4.5%. And with all those pluses, we have to have a minus to come up with our overall of a little less than 1%. And so residential decreased by about 4% between 2021 and 2022. Okay, next slide. Lots of numbers on this one. But what this is showing are the total revenue requirements for our scenarios. And before we get into the bottom line here, I have some of these color-coded. And the ones that are color-coded, starting at the top, it's kind of tan in color. There's several of those tans. Those are showing the labor cost increases. And we've assumed about a total of $1.2 million increase in total labor costs, and that's including benefits. We then have, I'll come back to that yellow in a minute, the blue line of the major repair and replacement fund. That was not in the budget, and we put in about $500,000 per year for that. We have in the green, that represents the capital improvements that need to be made. And so we have the depreciation of them, and then we have the interest on the assumed debt that we would be taking out for that. If we get to that yellow one, the payment in lieu of taxes, it's been assessed against the utility every year, but for some reason it was not in the budget this year. And so I included $1 million for that, because that's what it's been about in the past. Down at the bottom, so we have all these revenue requirements, and we've made some other adjustments as well. So what I did was I started with the 2023 budget, and then I make some adjustments, and then going forward from 2023 to 2024 through 6, we've included the labor and so on and so forth. We made a few other adjustments as well that I explained in my report. But we come up with a total revenue requirement, excluding your fuel and purchase power costs, of about $8.1 million, $8.2 million in 2023. But we need to add a target margin on there. We need to not set rates just to recover our expected expenses, because things can go wrong. They typically go wrong. And so we need to set rates to recover something more than what our expenses are projected to be. And so we've included, or I've included, a $500,000 per year target margin. So with that, we come up with a revenue requirement for scenario 1, which is the utility retention, of about $10.8 million in 2024. And it goes up each year with inflation and some other little adjustments that we've made. I've included inflation in all of these. General inflation I just assumed to be 2.5%. These days that could be low, but I'm an optimist, I don't know. So, and for the sale of the utility, we base that on the first year, the 2023 budget, and with that target margin, we come up with a revenue requirement of $8.66 or $8.7 million. Okay? So, next slide. Let's look at, will our existing rates recover that amount? So the way I calculate the revenues is that I take my assumed energy sales, demand sales, and number of customers, and I apply our existing rates to that. And so I then break it out by the rate class there, and so I have the rates, the revenues projected from 2023 over the next 4 years. I then put in that revenue requirement that we showed, that we saw in our previous slide, and there's in the first year we have that 8,661, and we come up with our projected revenues are shown to be $1.359 million short. Now that does include a $500,000 target margin, but even without that target margin, we're going to be a little bit short. And if we want to meet that target margin, we need to raise rates by 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. If we keep the utility and we look at 2024, which includes that increase in labor and the increase in infrastructure, or the infrastructure improvements, we come up with, we're $3.5 million short. And we're going to have to increase rates by 6.4 cents per kilowatt hour if we do nothing the year before. If we raise it by 2.5 cents the year before, but that's right now, we'd only have to raise it by 3.9. Only, I say that in quotes. The following year, 2025, we would have to increase it, if we increase it by 6.4 cents in early 2024. In 2025, we would have to increase it by about 0.7, a little less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And it kind of levels off after that. So we're kind of getting through this hump here with the additional staff and the additional salaries and the additional capital improvements. Once we get through that, then things kind of level out a little bit. But it's going to be a tough road to hoe for that next couple of years. Okay, so that's on the overall basis. So overall, we need to increase rates 2.5 cents if we decide to sell the utility, and I'm saying that 6.5 cents if we're going to keep the utility. That's on an overall basis. How does each rate class, how close do they come to their cost of service? Well, let's look at the next slide. Scenario 1, and if you look over the right-hand side here, you'll see that in the bottom line, we're seeing that in total, we're going to raise everybody's rates by 6.4 cents per kilowatt hour. Residential and industrial are the farthest away from their cost of service. Residential, to bring them to their cost of service, would be 7.7 cents per kilowatt hour increase. Industrial would be 6.4. And small general service and large general service, 5.5 to 6 cent range, and boat harbor, not quite so much. Street lights, it's such a small class that you can just ignore them, really, because if you're off by $5 with them, it's still going to be a large percentage. So we kind of ignore them, and we let them go along with the ride here. So this is a 1-year snapshot of scenario 1 of keeping the utility, and we're going to, this is a 3-year process, and you'd set the rates to go through 2026, and we'll look at some options here in the next few slides, but I'm just doing a 1-year snapshot here, and I would say that if you do move one to the other. I would base it on one, and then if we do some adjustments later, you do that on an across-the-board basis. But we'll get into that in a minute. So scenario 2 on the next slide, sell the utility. Again, off to the right, you see that there's that 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And again, residential and industrial need the largest adjustment. And in this one, industrial is a little bit more than residential. And small general service and large general service a little bit less than that. Okay, so next slide. There's a couple things to keep in mind as we go through this. These revenue requirements, they're not cast in stone. You do have some leeway in it. I mean, labor is going to be what it is, whatever you agree to on the amount of staffing and so on. Insurance is going to be what it is and so on, but there are some things that you might be able to do. And to put it in perspective, for every $1 million in savings or reduction in revenue requirements you can come up with, that reduces the overall rate adjustment by a little under 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So, target margin. We have $500,000 in there per year. Well, you really need to have some sort of margin in there, but you might want to decrease that a little bit. And so that would, might have some impact on the overall rate increase required. Payment in lieu of taxes. We have $1 million in there. Is that the correct amount? I don't know. And it's always been kind of like that, but I have no idea if that's the correct amount or not. Similarly, the administrative fee of about $1 million, that's been in there for as long as I can remember. And again, it's been about the same amount. And is that the right amount? I don't know. I will say, though, that if you do reduce the PILT, payment in lieu of taxes, or the admin fee, if you reduce them to save money for the electric utility, you're going to have to make it up from some other source, I presume. So, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul on that one. But it is something that you can do.
And that's one thing that we wanted to make sure that we did in this study, was to not cut anything until we hear back from the city, from all of you. So we wanted to make sure that we did not change the bill. We did not change the admin fee. Because historically that's what we've done, and until we heard otherwise, we had to move in that direction.
So, next slide. Let's start looking at some options of what we can do, given that these are the results that we would come up with. So for scenario 1, retain the utility, I've come up with 4 options. There are definitely more options that you can consider, and I'm at your disposal on that. You can suggest through Rob or whatever that an option you'd like to consider. So option 1 is to increase all rates by 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour, followed by a little bit more the following year. And the reason that I did this option, was to kind of set the bounds. What this one comes up with is meeting the revenue requirements only without the margin. So this is really kind of the bare minimum that you can do, is increase it by this, unless you come up with some savings elsewhere. I would not recommend this option, but again, I come up with it just to kind of set the bounds. Option 2 would be to, again, an across-the-board basis where you increase everybody's rates by 5.9 cents per kilowatt hour. And that results in a margin of about half of our target margin of $500,000. So that's kind of why I ran this one. Just kind of, so you kind of gain perspective on this. Option 3 was to increase everybody by the full 6.4 cents per kilowatt hour. And I'll show you here in just a minute in our next slide that this brings the residential class to within 94% of its cost of service. So in my mind, if you're within 5%, you're doing pretty good. Again, it's not an exact science. And, you don't want to be too hard on one rate class and not on another, so you have to spread the pain around. So again, that's why I ran this one in option 3. It was to see how close everybody would come. And then option 4, I ran this scenario where I raised the rates for a little bit differently in each rate class to try to move them to closer to their cost of service. And again, we're not moving them exactly there because, residential was quite a ways away, and so you don't want to hit them too hard at the same time. So if we can skip forward to 2 slides, please. This is where these options are shown. And again, scenario 1, we're increasing everybody by 5.5% or 5.5 cents. And we see that everybody, residential comes up to 90% of their cost of service. And Boat Harbor is a little bit over. Again, they're a pretty small rate class. And everybody is really close to their cost of service. But again, that target margin in blue over there, that margin is there's nothing there. So again, I did not want to really advocate this option, but it's there just to consider, to see where the bounds are. Option 2, where we're increasing everybody by 5.9 cents. Now we have kind of half our target margin. The residential is now up to 92%. A couple of them are over, and industrial is getting pretty close to 100% of their cost of service. And again, when you're within 5%, to me, that's good. Option 3, where we're increasing everybody by the full 6.4 cents per kilowatt hour. Residential is now at 94% of their allocated cost of service. You have your full target margin of $500 and some thousand. Small general service and large general service are paying more than their cost, but again, it's within 5%. And then finally, on option 4, this is where I'm moving everybody a little bit differently. So I move on this particular scenario, and again, there's as many scenarios as you want, or options. Residential, I increased by 6.5 cents. Small general service, 6. Boat Harbor, 5 cents. Large general service, 5.5 cents. In industrial, 6 cents. And I was moving everybody around to try and get everybody, I was trying to, minimize the pain for residential, so I brought them up to 95%. And then I was kind of manipulating the others to come up with half your target margin. And so there's not a science for any of this, but this is kind of what I came up with. And you can see that on the line in yellow, you can see what the average monthly bill increase is. And so let's look at option 4 there. The average bill would go up by about $41 per month, as compared to right now the average bill is about $152. So it's a pretty significant increase. And you can see what the average bill is going up for the other rate classes as well.
Now, Mike, we didn't start moving toward a cost of service in our rates here in Seward, if I'm accurate, until the last rate study. Is that correct?
I think it was 2 rate studies ago. We started to move towards it. What had happened was there was a rate that was in place for everybody. And it was increased by the CPI each year automatically. And rightly or wrongly, I suggested that we get away from that, because that does not hold anybody's feet to the fire on the utility to maintain costs if they don't need it. But if they need it and they need more, then there's not going to be enough. And so I thought it should be based more on what the revenue requirements actually were, and that the budget should be set based on that. So it's been a couple of years, but it's been a process that we've moved gradually towards cost of service. And so these numbers are consistent in the sense that residential has been less than cost of service in the past. So I think, let's see here. Yeah, go back one slide here if we could. Just one slide here. So we should, for scenario 1, you need to implement the rate adjustment right away. And then maybe during this upcoming year, you should investigate, should the full PILT be in there? Should the full admin fee be in there? And then in 2025, at the beginning of 2025, you would adjust the rates accordingly.
Right now, we're looking at, when we adjust, whatever adjustment we come up with, we're looking at January 1st of 2024 to implement.
Okay, now forward 2 slides if we could, please. Okay, now scenario 2, and we're getting towards the end here. Scenario 2, I would recommend, we saw that it was 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That was based on the full $500,000 target margin. I would suggest that you not decrease the target margin, because we're implementing this kind of a year late. 2023 is just about done. We're going to probably need that $500,000 for inflation and so on as the approval process goes through. I would also recommend that you implement it using on an across-the-board basis, simply because the acquiring utility is going to have its own cost of service. It's going to adjust your rates based on their cost of service and how they affect their own customers. So, just for rate stability, I would say you implement it on an across-the-board basis. Next slide shows what happens with the 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour increase. And the residential, the average bill goes up by a little under $16 per month. And everybody is well within the reasonable range. Small general service in Boat Harbor might be a little bit high, but for the most part, residential that's the one that's been the farthest away. They're close, they're relatively close there. So the next slide shows the monthly impact of all the options on the residential customer. Again, a lot of numbers, but this is now based on their full bill, which includes the COPA. And the COPA is about 40-some% of the total bill, 43% of the total bill. And this is based on this is based on the COPA that was about mid-year through 2023. Chugach's filed for a rate adjustment, and so if their fuel cost stays the same, we would expect to see that their bill to you will increase by about 6.5%. So as we can see here, let's just go over to say option 1.3, which is everybody increased by 6.4 cents per kilowatt hour. We see that on average, on an annual basis, down at the bottom there, we see that the average residential customer goes up by $40, and that is a 26% increase on their total bill when we include the Chugach bill as well, the COPE in there as well. Now, I might say too that I just made adjustments to the energy charge. You could make it such that the energy charge doesn't go up as much and increase the customer charge a little bit. I mean, there's always that option too. I mean, there's all kinds of options. So, in summary, if we go to the last slide, please. In summary, kind of what we're showing here, the analysis shown that the residential and industrial are farthest away from their allocated cost of service. That's kind of to be expected based on what we've looked in the past. And the industrial customers, we set up the industrial rate class last time and we weren't quite sure of our billing determinants and so on. If the utility is retained, there's going to have to be a series of rate adjustments that total of about 7 cents per kilowatt hour over the next couple of years. And that's about 30% of your total bill. Again, you might be able to reduce that by doing something to the PILT or the administrative fee, but again, you'd have to make that up from some other source. If the utility is sold, we'd have to raise rates by about 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, I would advocate that you don't do anything, you keep that target margin in there. You're not going to have time to look at PILT and admin fee and so on and so forth. And I will say that we've assumed that capital improvements are made in scenario 1 where you retain the utility. If the utility is sold, those capital improvements are still going to have to be made. Either you will do it and get reimbursed for it by the purchasing utility, or they're going to do it and they will include it in their rates later on at some point in time. Okay, so that concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Lots of numbers, I know.
Okay, I'm going to bring it to council for questions first, if you have any questions for them, and then we'll see what the public wants to say, okay? Any questions at this point? That was pretty thorough. I just have one big question. All of this assumes that we are going to have an increase in number of employees.
Retain scenario 1 does.
Right.
Yes.
And nowhere here does it specify the numbers. Is that somewhere that we could look at? I mean, we had that before, but that's...
Mayor McClure, we used about $800,000 on salaries and then 17% on the benefits.
It was a little bit more than so. But we included
the benefits.
Yeah.
And so total with the benefits, we were in the ballpark around $1 million added to it.
Okay. So assuming that, if we were to decide we didn't need that many employees or that much, that would change this whole...
Right. Again, for every $1 million reduction, it's a little under 2 cents per kilowatt hour.
But it's just something to continue to think about. And okay, that came to mind. And then real quickly, could you, for the people that don't know, in like 2 sentences, explain what PILT means?
Not quite sure I know either, but payment in lieu of taxes is a tax that you pay because their infrastructure would be taxed by the city.
Right.
And so since their infrastructure is not taxed, it is in recognition of that.
Okay. So where does that money come from?
Your ratepayers.
Okay. So we pay instead of getting tax. Okay. Just want everyone to hear that. Okay. Because this is kind of new to a lot of people, hearing this much detail.
And I would imagine for the public as well, when you look at your PILT and your admin fee, what we're paying in, it goes into the general fund, so that money is being used to support the city overall.
Yeah, and there's that. Okay. Any council questions at this point? Yeah, Councilmember.
Just maybe some clarification a little bit. The last rate study we had was in 2021, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the main difference, if I understand it, between that rate study and the one that you just completed is the different scenarios. Other than the different scenarios, the rate study's basically looking at the same things?
It's performed the same way, use the same model and so on, and the same classifications and allocations. So I would say, though, that the main difference really on this one is that it includes expenses, a significant amount of expenses that were not included before. And so it is utilities playing catch-up on certain things, and how do we allocate those costs? But it's performed the same way, same manner.
And Mike, I would say that, and you've heard me say this before, sewerage rates have been artificially low for a while because we haven't been investing as we should have in the system. So as we're playing catch-up, that's why you're going to see the bump up in the rates.
And again, going back to the results, that's why we see the large increase in 2024, 2025, larger in 2024, a little bit more in 2025, and then not so much after that. We're now caught up. I won't say caught up, but the majority.
Follow-up?
Yes, Madam Mayor, thank you. Just one thing that may not sound like a popular thing, it's a libertarian part of me coming out. When I look at the different rate classes, customer classes, and what the percentage that they're paying based on the cost of what they use, is there, other than being residential and liking to save a little money, it looks like the smaller businesses are carrying a heavier load than the residentials and the industrial customers. If you look at the percentage they're paying based on the cost of what they use, is there a reason that everybody just doesn't pay 100% of what it costs them to have power?
Well, again, it's not an exact science. And so, again, if you're within 5% or something like that, in my mind, you're doing pretty well on that. And it's really hard to say what it does cost to provide service to a particular customer. The NARUC manual has come up with a way to do it, and it's been adopted throughout the country.
And Mike, prior to Mike's rate study starting to move sewer toward cost of service, I imagine, Mike, and it was a pretty big gap in some of the classes, customer classes. So closing that gap is going to take a little bit of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember West.
I just wanted to make sure that I understand correctly. You said that you forecasted an increase of about $1 million, which includes benefits in salaries. But that if we were not to hire those additional people, we would save 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Is that correct?
Yeah, about that, yeah.
About
Yeah,
that.
Yeah, we had $1.2 million of increased salaries in there for both increased salaries and positions, and for every $1 million, it's 1.8 cents, so we're looking at about 2 cents per kilowatt hour probably on that.
Follow-up.
So my follow-up, I guess, is more of a statement than a question. That's not that much of a savings by diminishing the number of employees. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I like to, you have to keep things in perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions from council? Administration, did you have, I'll get the public in just a minute. Did you have any questions?
No comments, nothing.
Okay, question. Okay, so, public, who wants to ask questions or talk? I'm probably best to come up If you can talk really loudly, you can talk from back there, I guess. Go ahead. Thank you.
So the slideshow shows lots of numbers, and there are, everything that we've worked from has been from the 2024 budget, which you as a council did balance when we were talking about keeping our utility. And I think I've heard from the gentleman next to me that there are a lot more expenses that are new, and the public would like to know what line in our 2024 budget those new expenses are coming from. I do understand that there's an estimate 2-cent savings for every $1 million reduction in expenses. And I do understand that there is an estimated $800,000 estimate in salaries. But I guess my question is, if we're talking about increasing 7 cents, where is the extra, let's see, 7 cents minus 2 cents is 5 cents, that's $1 million. So where's the extra $2.5 million in expenses that you guys are presenting? Thank you.
I have not seen the 2024 budget.
I've got it. But again, I think this goes back to our capital projects that we need to include in the scenario where we keep the utility. And then you look at the increased cost in materials, inflation, those types of things, the salaries that Rissy mentioned as well. So there are a number of new costs that go into that. One item that is also included is we're working on the infrastructure project. And as part of the infrastructure project, we have one substation that is yet to be committed in our spending with the $10 million bond and the $5 million I've mentioned to council in the past. That is the refurbishment of the Spring Creek substation at the end of Nash Road. That project by itself is about $3.3 million. So that's going to be coming out of the enterprise fund, another 3.3. It's probably closer now with inflation to 3.5 from when we did the estimate. And that will be included in this particular rate study and paid for as part of the process over the next 3 years. The plan would then be to come back in for another rate study in 3 years. We would like to get on a 3-year cycle with our rate studies.
Okay. Did that.
May I follow up?
Yeah.
So I hear that we're going to count a $3.5 million infrastructure project that was slated to come out of the electric fund reserves, but we're going to account it as a cost for the next 2 years. Is that correct, Rob?
That is correct. 3 years.
Is that $3.5 million not in the reserves already?
The 3.5 is in the reserves, correct. But it's a cost that's being added.
But, yeah, so you'll have to pay depreciation. Depreciation will be included on your expenses for that, as well as any debt that you incur for it as well.
Okay, so just to follow up, just to make clear that we are budgeting as an expense an infrastructure project, just one of them, although we have a handful of them, but we're going to choose one of them to create an expense for the next 2 years that already has funds in the reserve allocated, which is approximately $2.5 million in the first year and $1 million in the second year to account for a rate increase. When really, I think if it's coming out of the reserves, it's paid for. I don't see how it's an expense, although I do understand the depreciation is something that needs to be accounted for.
If I could say, so when a capital addition is made, let's say you go out and buy a computer or something like that, you may expense that. Depends on how big a company you are. So that may show up as an expense on your profit and loss margin sheet. But if you go out and pay for a $1 million upgrade or something like that, that is what's considered to be a capital expense. And that is capitalized, and it does not show up on your profit and loss sheet. What will happen is that your balance sheet will go down in cash and increase on plant and service, but your expenses will increase for the depreciation on that asset. And your interest expense might be, if you take out debt for it, will increase as well. So the adjustments that we did from going forward was that we included, again, about $1.2 million for increased labor costs. That may or may not be in your 2024 budget.
So-
We decreased transmission operations by $300,000 because these new people are, because a lot of the work on the transmission clearing has been completed. And so we decreased that by about $300,000. We then increased in some other little minor things, you know, $30,000 here, 15 here, and so on. But the big things are that the PILT was included for $1 million. We included $500,000 for the maintenance reserve fund, and $300,000 increase for depreciation. We also included an across-the-board inflation to a lot of things as well, because you know we have to expect that a lot of these expenses are going up. So in total, we included things, we increased things by about $2.5 million. A little less than half of that or right around a half of that was the labor. And the other big things are, again, the PILT, the maintenance reserve fund, and depreciation. And then on top of that, we included a $500,000 target margin.
Okay, thank you.
So we're taking $3 million out of our reserves, increasing our expenses to get that $3 million back into our reserves over the next 2 years.
Does anyone else have a question, or come on up, Bruce?
Bruce Joff, Outside City Limits. Very interesting report. I did read it. I appreciate the explanation. A couple questions. Would you say that not exact science is roughly the same thing as arbitrary?
No.
Okay, could you explain the difference?
I would say that arbitrary is throwing a dart and we're just coming up with something. We are doing this in a prescribed manner, and that we're within, like I say, 5% or something like that. We should consider that to be reasonably close.
And would you say that some of the, Councilmember Wells asked about, no, I can't remember, maybe Councilmember Lynch, about the fairness or the distribution of the costs. Would you say that's more philosophy than anything else? Who's going to pay the biggest cost? You know, let's hit the rich guy, let's hit the working guy.
Now, let's just take an example. I'll take two examples here. A transformer. You put in a transformer, and that transformer, you're going to have, for a residential customer, is going to be, you know, it costs X dollars. For an industrial customer, it's going to cost more than that because it's going to be a larger transformer. Okay, so we recognize that when we allocate the cost to each customer class. We go through this process that recognizes that. Okay, let's look at our transmission line. And it's the same way. We have to build that to meet the system peak. And so the large customers that are adding more to the system peak, we recognize that. And so we allocate that stuff to them based on their contribution to system fee. So there is a rational method
Yeah,
for this.
good. I expected there was, particularly because you quoted this manual. It's sort of like spinning reserve, having enough for the demand.
That's arbitrary.
Okay. The data that you used, it was very similar, or that you presented tonight is very similar to what the ad hoc committee used. So I guess I would ask, did you get all your data from the electric utility director?
Sitting down with them and talking to them, but
And with the finance department.
and with the finance department.
Okay. And the last one, the contract that you were given, which was based on Resolution 2023-064, said that you were going to compare sewer rates to other utility rates. It didn't say anything about studying a sale. So who gave you the direction to study the sale and put it into the data?
Well, I guess that talking with staff and so on, it sounded like that was kind of the way to go, is that the sale was being considered. And so, there's two options on that. Either it's going to be sold or not sold, and does that have an effect on the revenue requirements? And it will have a very much of an effect on revenue requirements.
So, Mr. Jeff, that direction came from me.
Okay.
Directly, and it came after the council had made the determination to put this back on the ballot. And so we had to look at two scenarios going into this for that reason.
Mr. Montgomery, you recognize that the contract and the resolution that was written didn't include that. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Go ahead.
I guess Tom Tugas, Inside the City Limits. This situation reminds me a lot of 25 years ago. So 25 years ago, the city council operated the clinic and hospital, and I can tell you it was a mess. You had people coming to the dais complaining about this doctor and that doctor, and it was a mess. The building was in terrible shape. The infrastructure had been neglected. We had no one in the administration or the city council who had ever managed a hospital or was qualified to manage a hospital. And personally, I was very glad and very much encouraged Providence to take over the hospital and the clinic, because that's what they do. And I believe that if we had sold the electric in 2000, which was the last time we voted on this, that our electric utility would be much farther along and our infrastructure would be much better than we are today. And 25 years ago, when we had all these discussions about should the city be managing, we might lose control of the healthcare and Seward if if Providence takes over. But my concern is that none of us in this room, well, most of us in this room, none of us in administration or in the city council are experts in running an electric utility, and I truly appreciate the effort that all of our utility employees put in, but there's no way that 10 employees of Seward can provide the same level of expertise that people who do this for a living, that manage utilities, can do, in the same way that there's no way that we are capable of running a hospital better than Providence is. So to me, there's a real parallel, and I was thinking about it the last few days, that that's why I have been, I admit I don't understand the difference between Chugach's offer and Homer Electric's offer, but the bottom line for me is that I think we need to have people who are experts in running an electric utility, running electricity, in the same way that Providence runs our hospital for us.
Anyone else in the public want to speak? Linda?
Linda Paquette, Outside City Limits, also a member of PACAD. in this moment, what I would like to point out is that as a member of PACAB, I witnessed Mr. Montgomery negotiate with the ratepayers that were not paying enough, because they were really not paying enough. And that was a very difficult and touchy subject, and yet he led us through those negotiations, and those ratepayers are now paying more. It's not fair that just a few people get to pay pennies on the dollar when everybody else is pulling the weight. And he helped correct that. And I think that he needs to have some kudos for that. I think he needs recognition for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maynard. Who else wants to talk? We've got about 10 minutes. Come on.
Daryl Schaefer, Meyer Inside the City. I'm going to present just a little bit different perspective. First, I would add that the City of Seward has successfully operated electric utility for many, many decades. And it has been to the advantage of this community in a lot of ways to be able to do things to attract business and industry here, because we did operate the utility and we had flexibility that weren't subject to regulatory commissions. And we're able to do so in the context of what it means to the greater benefit of the Corporation of Seward. Now, I think that PILT that you talk about, that administrative fee, has, in the last 10 years, that's been over $18 million. It's gone to the benefit of your general fund. And, you know, you've got to look at your all revenues requirements here for the entire city, not just the enterprise fund. The enterprise fund is there to benefit your corporation. Now, when you sell, it's going to go away. You won't have that opportunity ever again. You'll be subject to somebody that's a ways away, whether it be Anchorage or Homer, a utility that doesn't live here, doesn't look at the things in the context that you get to look at it, operating the budgets that you do and representing the citizenry that live here. That has some real value and benefit. And, you know, I'd like to at least speak to that, and I respect you always for the differing opinions that we have in this community, and you know, I hold no grudges. But I feel very, very strongly about that we're giving up, we're selling off our community chunk by chunk. We have given so much away to the other side of the peninsula in so many different ways. We've seen our retail sector diminish here. You can't buy a 2x4 here anymore. We just lost another, for whatever reasons, but we've lost another hardware store that we don't really have again. I really feel that we've got to be very careful about what we give away here. Because once we give that away, you're going to give that $15 million of revenue that the electric fund generates roughly. It's all going to go to Homer or Kenai or something. It's not going to stay here. And I really think that we need to look at that, and I plead with you to do so. I know that you guys have different beliefs, perhaps, and I respect those, and I don't find fault with you in that. But I feel very strongly that we just can't give away. We still own the hospital, by the way. We still own that infrastructure. We contract to have it managed. That's not the same situation you're talking about when you divest yourself of the electric utility. You're giving that away. It's gone. You don't own it anymore. You don't have any say-so about how it's managed. So I just offer that up to you, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for like one or two more here.
I get a lot of I get a lot of questions, so.
Just keeping track of the time, though,
Yeah.
is plenty to.
So, hi, I'm on the ad hoc committee, and I'm like looking at numbers here, so I just have lots of questions. So, the 2024 budget had a PILT in it. Are you saying the 2023 didn't?
That's correct.
Okay, but the 2024 one did. Did you work off the 2024 budget at all?
Oh, yeah, we started too early for that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand, do you work a line item, sheet just like for every line item of the electric budget? You did. Can you share that with
It's
us?
in my report.
It's in your report. And is your report public today? It is?
Yeah.
Okay, because the ad hoc committee really needs these line item numbers in order for us to finish our work, so.
Well, and what aspect of the report, deeper than this?
Oh, yeah, each line item, do you want me to show you what?
Well, no, I know what you're saying, but the question is has that been made public?
It's in my report. What she's asking for is in my report. It's in.
This PowerPoint's not his report.
No,
Right.
right. The PowerPoint is not the full
Oh,
report.
I know.
And the full report, I don't know that it's been made public yet, but we easily can.
That's my question.
Yeah, not a problem.
Okay, it's public. I just wanted to verify that.
Okay, I had a real quick question here, and then I got some more in-depth ones. On your PowerPoint, I'm just trying to find the right page now. It was a date, a year on here, and then Rob said someone said a different year, so I just want to clarify that. Sorry, there's a couple of blank pages in here, it gets confusing. Okay, on scenario 1, it said rate adjustments at the beginning of 2025, and I heard Rob say 2024, so I'm a little confused about this.
It would be 2025. At the beginning of 2024, you would make a rate adjustment of, let's say, 6%, 6 cents per kilowatt hour or whatever.
Right.
Then during 2024, if you're going to adjust, or if you're going to make adjustments to the PILT or the admin fee, that's going to take some study. So you would do that during.
Oh, so this is only adjustments for the PILT and admin fee. It's not adjustments for the rates. This says rate adjustment.
But in 2025, absent doing anything else, and if you increase everybody by 6.4 cents per kilowatt hour in the beginning of this coming year.
24.
In 24. In 25, you would still have to increase everything by 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, you may not increase them by that 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour because you might do some adjustments to PILT or whatever.
Okay, so this 2025 is only based on the research about the PILT and the admin fee. Thank you, I needed to understand that. Okay, let me go back to see what other questions I have here. So this was totally based on the budget as given to you by the electrical manager, right?
Finance department.
Finance
And,
department,
yeah, the finance department, okay, and it was the 2023 budget.
Right, and I'm not sure that the ad hoc committee has included PILT in there, because I saw on the most recent one that I got today, this afternoon, I saw PILT and then a negative line under it, equal to PILT, taking it out.
And let me
Well,
comment.
we'll talk, the ad hoc
Can I
committee will
do-
talk about its stuff. I just want to ask you questions, okay? Okay, so basically, what you've done is you've added about $500,000 for MERC, 1 million for PILT, another $500,000 for the target margin. And then basically the transmission reduction is balanced out by the depreciation increase. And then how much was inflation, percentage-wise and dollar-wise?
2.5%.
2.5% of what number?
It's in my report.
It's in your report, okay, all right, so we'll get all those numbers then, okay. Great. just make sure I don't have any other questions. Thank you, council, for waiting. Is there anyone else back there waiting for me to get out this chair?
Yeah.
Okay, I better get out the chair. If I
We
come up with another
really
question,
have
I'll
only
do
about
it.
5 minutes
Yeah,
left,
and-
so if you can keep your comments, questions
Yeah,
brief.
and I have a question for our finance director, Sully. The PILT, is that where we have it in the budget, but then it's transferred out, so you show it on 2 line items?
You should have an expense and a transfer for the general fund.
Correct. And so that's one reason it may be not showing and it's out of the budget, correct? Okay.
Skip Ryerson, Inside City Limits. The PILT is a transfer, it's below your budget. It's added to the ad hoc committee's budget, so an update I think you'll be provided. Couple points that I'd like to make. One, Mike, I know you got this handy manual, I'd love to read that someday. I'm a numbers guy, so it'd be fun to read through that. One of the things that I'm a little bit confused by is we've been talking quite a bit about additional capital outlays for $3.5 million cash, depreciation, MRFs, and it's almost like it's an apples and oranges kind of a situation. An example is, if we're going to use depreciation as a cost component in this rate study, I'm questioning how can we add $500,000 for capital costs if that's coming out of depreciation? It almost seems like we're double dipping on the MRF, because the MRF funds come from the depreciation. You end up having that as a non-cash expense. Technically, you're generating $1.6 million in the surplus funds. You're taking from those surplus funds, you're taking a part of that and putting in your MRF, and then you're taking a part of it, and I think Mike backed out your principal capital or bond repayment of about $200,000. So he backed that out because that's paid for from the proceeds of the enterprise. So I'd ask Mike if he can take a closer look at whether we are double dipping, because the MRF, it's a little confusing. It's major repair and replacement fund. And because we haven't been funding it for 7 years, we haven't had a lot of discussions about it or what it's been used for. So it's a little mystery to folks. But if you think of it, I look at it and I think of it as a capital savings account for capital projects. Have we been putting $420,000 a year in for the last 7 years, this man would have had another $4.2 million in his fund to pay for this project, and that would have required less bond financing, okay? So I'd ask that you take a look at that if you would, please. The other thing about depreciation, if you would, could I ask that you take a look, get with Sully and take a look at the pro forma 10-year forecast for depreciation? I don't know if in some cases this is equipment, so if a transformer, I don't know what the depreciable life of a $500,000 transformer is, and if those depreciate out in 5 years, then this depreciation will go from 1.6 million, it could drop off to 800,000 in 3 years. So I just ask that we look at that a little further.
That's in my report.
Is it?
Yep.
Okay, that's the other report that we haven't seen yet, right?
It's in one of
All
our
right.
appendices.
So good, that answers that question. Thanks very much for that. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We've got about 2 more minutes for public, and then I want to bring it back for a very brief wrap-up so we can get on with this meeting.
I had the same question Skip did about the 500,000 for the MRF and the 500,000 for the target margin, because it seemed they were similar things, and we talked in the ad hoc committee about adding the 500,000 to kind of catch up and build a reserve for these capital projects. And then I just wanted to clarify, the PILT is money that the city receives from the electrical utility. Do we also give money like that goes into the general fund? You mentioned like $2 million just a minute ago. So is it the PILT plus $2 million that goes into the city fund?
It's the PILT, and then we do an admin fee for around $1 million as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that with the PILT is about $2 million.
Okay.
And then we also had a conversation about the license fee of $300,000 that we talked about at the last ad hoc committee.
Mm-hmm.
And I've, and I'll have to ask Sully again, but I'm not sure what that 300 represents going back to the city.
So if we sold, the city would still have to come up with $2 million to replace that money that would be normally coming in, which is going to raise rates somewhere, maybe not on the electrical rates, but tax rates.
And that's why when we did the study, we went with the assumption that your PILT remains, your admin fee remains, because that's all the information we had to work with at the time. If you lower those things, then it would be incumbent upon the city and the city council to make a decision, do they need to find that money elsewhere?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring it back to council for any last questions for these guys. This is going to be an ongoing conversation as we don't know what's going to happen until after the election. Anyway, Councilmember Finch.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to give recognition of Rob Montgomery for the stuff that he has done since he's been in his position, because I've lived here 30 years and I've lost count of power outages. But since he's been here, you know, the transmission right-of-ways were a mess. Power poles in Nash Road were verging collapse. He's taken care of a lot of that. Security fences around Fort Raymond, OSHA violations for written safety procedures on the lockout situation, and many safety deficiencies that were identified in a report by Alaska Power Associations he's addressed. Bob Montgomery's done a lot of stuff for this so-called successful utility company when it was failing miserably. It's nice, Rob, not to have power outages, and I'm glad you guys brought in that tree clearing service, because for 30 years, I couldn't believe our trees looked like that.
And Councilmember Fitch, I'd just like to say that it's really a team effort. So everyone in the electric department has contributed to this, and as well as city council supporting the initiatives that we brought to you. So.
Thank you. Administration, did you have any comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, the only comment that we have is thank you to Mike Hubbard for presenting tonight, and that we will forward the full report from him through Chris to the ad hoc committee first thing in the morning.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, I'm going to adjourn the work session at 6:51. We'll resume at 7 with the regular meeting.